Hello, my name is Kathleen Cleveland Kennedy. I am the statewide care coordinator with Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia with the CSEC response team. Today, I'm going to give a presentation on commercial sexual exploitation of children. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the warning signs to look out for, talk about what the CSEC response team in Georgia, what we can do, how we conduct assessments. And then we'll talk a little bit about prevention in terms of signs to look out for, as well as ways that you can get involved to help end human trafficking in Georgia. So without further ado, I will share my screen. So we'll dive right in and I'll start talking about the issue and start off with providing some definitions about human trafficking and CSEC in particular. Before I dive into those, I do want to start off by just doing a brief activity where we're talking about some common statements, some of them misconceptions, some of them not, that we hear when people hear of human trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation of children. So there's 3 statements on this slide, and I'm going to go through and talk to you a little bit about if they are a myth or a fact and why that is. So the first statement is youth choose to enter the sex trade. This is something that we hear commonly in our field. Oftentimes individuals think that it's the child's own behaviors that lead to their exploitation. And sometimes youth do have behaviors that place them at risk. But there is a well-known survivor with lived experience who made a statement along the lines that in order for there to be a choice, there has to be at least 2 viable alternatives. And some of the things that we're going to talk about and that you'll start to see throughout this presentation is that for many of our youth, even youth that may be commercially sexually exploited without a trafficker or somebody else forcing or coercing them, often there aren't any other alternatives. They are put in situations where they have to meet their own needs. And so therefore there isn't much of a choice. Furthermore, there has been some data that's come out surrounding youth, specifically female youth, that have experienced homelessness or unstable housing. And what it found is that over 1 in 3 homeless female youth have engaged in commercial sexual activity based on a study that was done in 2018. And of those individuals that engaged in a commercial sexual activity, 75% of them were approached by somebody else saying that they would somehow provide them some type of basic need or money to meet their basic needs if they were to offer sexual acts. And so a lot of the research shows us that time and time again, that even when there is not a trafficker present, you have vulnerable youth placed in vulnerable situations, and that the buyers of these youth are often the ones that are approaching these youth and tying those youth's basic needs to their exploitation. The second statement is children in the commercial sex industry are bad kids. This is also a myth. Oftentimes when we work with youth that have experienced commercial sexual exploitation, one of the things that we know is they have experienced a whole lot of trauma, and that they're often polyvictimization victims, meaning they have experienced several types of trauma. And so what ends up happening at times is that youth end up getting defined by their behaviors. And one of the things that we know about behaviors is that behaviors are a response to an unmet need or an unaddressed trauma. And so youth that are in the commercial sex industry are not bad kids. They may have behaviors that can be at times sometimes hard to navigate. At times there may be concerns that they leave without permission. At times they may get labels like they're defiant or they're aggressive. But every time when we're working with youth and people start using labels and labeling their behaviors, always remember that behaviors are a response to an unmet need and unaddressed trauma. And the last one is kids solicit sex because of a substance abuse disorder. And so this is a tricky one. This is primarily a myth. However, we know that youth that have concerns for substance abuse are at much greater risk for commercial sexual exploitation. If a youth has a substance abuse disorder, that then puts them in a situation where traffickers or other individuals can then tie the only way that the youth is able to obtain those substances is if they engage in commercial sex acts. And so oftentimes substance abuse disorders can create the vulnerability that places them at risk, but it's not necessarily the substances themselves that are causing the exploitation. It's the environment that's created and the situation where a youth has a substance abuse disorder that's not being met, individuals recognizing that, and then tying the youth's access to substances to sexual acts. Additionally, we also know that a lot of traffickers or gangs that are exploiting youth will use substances as part of a means of coercion. So many youth are forced into substance use, and that is an easy way for traffickers to be able to maintain control over youth. And so the nexus between substance abuse among youth and CSEC is certainly high, but the story behind that can be a little bit complicated. So next, we're going to talk about a few definitions and talk about what human trafficking is, and specifically define what CSEC is. So CSEC falls under a large umbrella known as human trafficking. And human trafficking can simply be defined as a crime that involves exploiting a person for labor services or commercial sex. And so then underneath that umbrella, you have labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And labor trafficking, it involves the recruitment, the harboring, transportation, or obtaining of a person for labor or services by force, fraud, or coercion. And so some common fields or some common businesses that you may see labor trafficking occur could be things like the agricultural industry, the construction industry, the nannying industry, even the adult entertainment industry. Even for our youth. And the adult entertainment industry can provide a concern because youth that are being forced or are working in the adult entertainment industry, they're not able to consent. And so in those situations, you almost have this gray area where a youth is not only being labor trafficked, but sex trafficked as well. And so with labor trafficking, when there is elements of force, fraud, or coercion, and somebody is being forced to provide some type of labor or service for individuals, then that is where concerns for labor trafficking come up. So then sex trafficking is defined as a commercial sex act, which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or when the person performing the act is under the age of 18. And so keeping that in mind, the definition for CSEC is sexual activity involving a child in exchange for something of value or promise thereof to that child or another person. So in these situations, the child is being treated as a commercial sexual object. I want to go back to the definition of sex trafficking for a minute, though, because in order for law enforcement and other prosecutors to really be able to start diving into sex trafficking cases, you'll notice that it indicates that an element of force, fraud, or coercion must be present, except for when the youth or when the individual is under the age of 18. And so what that's saying is that individuals under the age of 18 cannot engage in sexual acts in exchange for items of value, which means it doesn't matter if the youth is 16 or 17, because here in Georgia, we do know the age of consent is 16. If items of value are being exchanged either to that youth or to another individual, youth are not legally allowed to consent. And this also goes back to that question that I asked a couple of slides ago about whether youth choose to enter the sex trade. In the state of Georgia and nationwide legally, the answer to that is also no. Youth cannot agree to exchange sexual acts for items of value. And what that also means is that the elements of force, fraud, or coercion do not have to be present in order for a youth to be confirmed as CSEC. So anytime there's a concern that a youth is engaged in sexual acts and either that youth or somebody else has received items of value or a promise of items of value for that sexual act, that would be considered commercial sexual exploitation. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about where and how trafficking occurs. And so there's generally 6 paradigms of CSEC that are recognized as far as different ways that trafficking can occur. And I'm going to go over each of these in this slide. Oftentimes, when we think about the commercial sexual exploitation of children or human trafficking, a lot of people tend to think of it in terms of what gets portrayed on the media. And so a common movie that some of you may be aware of is the movie Taken. And so a lot of times people have this perception that with human trafficking, youth or individuals that are trafficked or abducted, they're held against their will, possibly put in an area that they're not allowed to leave. And that it happens, things that's happened when you go overseas or when you go to big cities. However, one of the things that we know working in the trafficking field and being a CSEC response team is that those situations make up a very small portion of the cases that we see. But the most common paradigm of trafficking that most of us are aware of is trafficking facilitated CSEC or trafficker facilitated CSEC. And in this type of trafficking, that's where you have an individual or group of individuals that are using different elements of coercion and manipulation in order to get youth to engage in sexual acts in exchange for most of the time money. And most of the time in these situations, the trafficker control many aspects of that youth's life, including when they eat, when they sleep, their daily schedule. The youth is forced to engage in sexual acts, oftentimes multiple times a day. And at the end of it, the trafficker takes nearly all of that money. Another type of trafficking, and this is the type of trafficking that we're starting to see more and more of throughout the state, is gang facilitated CSEC. And with gang facilitated CSEC, that is where a gang is coercing youth to exchange sexual acts, either as a means to bring revenue into the gang or as a means of initiation into the gang. There was actually a study that was done by the Receiving Hope Center, which is a 90-day receiving facility that accepts and houses youth that are confirmed for commercial sexual exploitation. And several years ago, they did a survey with youth that had been admitted to the Receiving Hope Center. It was all solely based on youth report. And one of the questions they asked youth is whether they had gang associations. And what they found out is that 66% of the youth that had been accepted into the Receiving Hope Center had reported some type of gang association or gang connection. We believe that that number is actually much higher because we know that due to the secrecy that is involved with gangs and the pressure to not discuss what happens in gangs, that there are several youth that often will not disclose gang involvement. So the fact that 66% of youth readily disclosed that they did have gang involvement shows that the nexus between gang involvement and human trafficking is a very strong one. In the middle, you see a picture of a computer, and that is representative of technology facilitated CSEC. There has been a lot of research that has shown that technology is actually the #1 facilitator of human trafficking worldwide. And so we know that with technology and access to the internet and social media and different apps, that technology can be used as a magnificent tool to help us improve efficiency and get things done. But we also know that when unsupervised and unmonitored, that it can be a very dangerous place. And that is no different for our youth. A significant portion of the youth that we serve and ultimately end up confirming as CSEC, 70 to 80% of them, as an estimate, at least have some type of technology component to their trafficking, whether that is explicit images or videos of the youth are being shared in exchange for items of value, or whether the internet or apps are being used as a means to set up what is often referred to as dates or plays. But technology absolutely is a massive facilitator of human trafficking, not only in the state of Georgia and not only for children, but for adults too, and nationwide as well. Over here on the top right, you'll see a picture of a house, and that is representative of family facilitated CSEC. And if you were to ask me which type of CSEC are we lagging behind in terms of identification, or where do we have the most room for growth, I would argue that family facilitated CSEC is that paradigm where we have the most room for growth. And with family facilitated CSEC, that is where a youth is being coerced or forced to engage in sexual acts, either with a family member in exchange for items of value, or that family member is arranging for other individuals to exchange sexual acts with the child in exchange for either money or other items of value. A couple of things that we know is that the risk factors that are associated with family facilitated CSEC are often a little bit different compared to other types of CSEC that youth may experience. For instance, these youth can sometimes be younger, while the vast majority of youth that experience family facilitated CSEC are still between the ages of 14 to 17. Almost 25% of youth are 13 or below. Additionally, some other research that we know about family facilitated CSEC is we know that some research tells us that about 60 to 66% of the time when a youth is being trafficked by a family member, that during those instances, about 60 to 66% of the time, it is the mother. The additional 30 to 35% is the father or stepfather or an uncle or some other relative. Some other risk factors that are specific to family facilitated CSEC is we know that these youth are much less likely to have a history of leaving home without permission or running away, and that the youth themselves are much less likely to have a substance abuse concern, but the family member that is exploiting them is much more likely to have a substance abuse concern. On the bottom right, you see a picture of a youth that's holding up a homeless sign, and that's indicative of buyer-perpetrated trafficking. This was also formerly called survival sex. And with buyer-perpetrated trafficking, these are situations often where a youth may be homeless or doesn't have access to basic needs, and they are engaging in sexual acts in order to meet their basic needs. A few slides ago, I talked about the significant concern, especially among female youth and homelessness, and how often they get approached by adults when homeless to engage in sexual acts. And so with these situations, when youth possibly are experiencing poverty or unstable housing, buyer-perpetrated trafficking is certainly a concern for those youth. And then finally, you see a picture of a massage parlor here, and that is indicative of business facilitated CSEC. And so with business facilitated CSEC, that is where a business may be involved in trafficking or having individuals under the age of 18 to engage in sexual acts for items of value. Or it could be a situation where traffickers or other individuals are trafficking youth out of their establishment, and the business is turning a blind eye, likely because that is continuing to bring in revenue for them as well. So illicit massage businesses, adult entertainment industries are some places where youth could be trafficked by the business, but you may also see an element of business facilitated CSEC at a hotel, where you have a trafficker that is having a youth stay at a hotel, and the hotel is not reporting those concerns and is allowing it to go on, as it's continuing to also provide revenue for that hotel as well. So next, I'm going to talk about the impact. We're going to talk about who's at risk and some of the consequences that are associated with commercial sexual exploitation of children. If you were to ask me what is the one risk factor that is most highly correlated with commercial sexual exploitation, it's absolutely a history of childhood sexual abuse. A lot of recent research shows that between 70 and 90% of youth that are confirmed for CSEC have a history of childhood sexual abuse. And this chart, which is actually borrowed from a nonprofit out of New York that serves trafficking victims, highlights why sexual abuse, especially when it is chronic, especially when it goes unreported or unaddressed, or in situations maybe where the family is not supportive or does not believe the youth, can be such a significant risk factor for CSEC. We know that when children are sexually abused, that first and foremost, that youth's boundaries are violated. Their sense of self, their sense of bodily autonomy, their sense of who they are, all gets violated. And so that can lead to guilt and shame, and it can lead to the child viewing themselves as a sexual object. It can absolutely lead to low self-esteem, and it can also lead to youth not understanding the difference between love, sex, and abuse. That could lead to youth running away or leaving home in order to escape the abuse or because of unaddressed trauma, and that could certainly lead to homelessness. And so in those situations, the low self-esteem, the guilt and shame, or even if they're running away and find themselves in a homeless situation, there's automatically a poverty and a need that is developed. There's needs that are not being met, both on a physiological level, but on an emotional level as well. And so that then opens the door where adults can approach them, where off the bat, as soon as an adult has an interaction with that child, there's an unequal power dynamic. When you combine that with the fact that the sex industry is a billion-dollar industry, you can see how that can easily lead to youth being approached by recruiters, buyers, and traffickers. This next slide highlights some of the additional vulnerabilities that can place youth at risk for commercial sexual exploitation. The first two that I want to start off by discussing, though, are the two boxes here on the far right. The desire for independence and takes boundaries and tests boundaries and takes unhealthy risk. That may sound like most teenagers. And the reason that we have those included is because we want to highlight that simply part of the teenage experience creates a vulnerability for children. The fact that youth want to be independent, the fact that youth want to be on their own and meet their own needs, and the fact that youth, it's normal in that stage to take boundaries, test boundaries, or maybe take risks that we would not otherwise take, can place youth at risk for CSEC victimization. And so with that, that also means that any youth can become a victim of commercial sexual exploitation. Since we became the statewide response in October of 2020, we have had youth of every gender, every sexual orientation, every socioeconomic status from every part of the state, both rural, suburban, and metro, that have been confirmed victims of commercial sexual exploitation. But it's some of these other additional vulnerabilities that can place youth at increased risk for CSEC. A concerning trend that we're seeing more and more in terms of how youth are being recruited into CSEC victimization is we are seeing that traffickers and gangs and other exploiters are increasingly using peer recruitment as a means to recruit new youth into the gang. And part of that is because from a young age, we do a great job of letting children know that they shouldn't talk to strangers and they shouldn't talk to people that they don't know. And so gangs and traffickers have learned that youth are aware of that. But they also know that especially when you start getting into your teenage years, your primary circle of influence is your friends. And so the people that are most apt, the people that youth are most likely to trust are their friends during this time frame. And so it is very common that we see when youth talk about how they became commercially sexually exploited, it often started with another peer recruiting them. And so if you're working with youth and they're identifying that they know individuals or they are friends with individuals that are involved in CSEC or sex work or trafficking, then that certainly is a red flag. We talked about low self-worth and loneliness and how youth and the need to want to fit in and to feel loved and to be loved and to belong can absolutely place youth at risk for commercial sexual exploitation. Youth that come from a family with a history of substance abuse or dependence absolutely is a concern and can continue to place youth at risk, not only because there's a history of family substance abuse place them at risk for trafficking or intrafamilial trafficking. We also know that could create the scenario where a youth may have unstable housing or experience homelessness. Youth that have involvement in the child welfare system often have an extensive history of abuse or neglect or trauma, and they're more likely to have some of these other vulnerabilities. So when you have youth that have a history of involvement in the child welfare system, that can be another condition that can increase a youth's risk for CSEC. Youth that have substance abuse concerns or youth that have developmental or intellectual disabilities are at risk. There's some research out there that suggests that as a whole, there's an under-identification of CSEC among youth that have developmental and intellectual disabilities, but that they are at much higher risk for commercial sexual exploitation. LGBTQIA plus youth are 7 to 9 times more likely to have to exchange sex for a place to stay as compared to their heterosexual youth. And that could be based in whether if the youth is not accepted within their home community, or if they're getting bullied at school, that may lead the youth to either leaving home or seeking out attention from individuals that creates that vulnerability that could be exploited by another individual. And then the last vulnerability that I want to highlight is being a member of a marginalized population. One of the concerning trends that we have seen since we took over the response in 2020 is that youth of color are significantly overrepresented in our data. Over the last 2 years, at least 70% of the youth we served have been youth of color. And we know that when you compare that to the general demographics in the state of Georgia, that does not match. And so that is absolutely a concern that is present not only in the state of Georgia, but nationwide, in that youth of color are overrepresented, not only in terms of the number of referrals that we receive, but also in terms of the number of confirmations that we have as well. So one of the other things when we look at commercial sexual exploitation, and we look at not only what places a youth at risk of being commercially sexually exploited, but additionally, what may create the circumstances in which a youth may return to a trafficking situation, it can usually pretty easily be explained by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so one of the things that we frequently find is that youth that have experienced commercial sexual exploitation often don't have these bottom 3 layers met consistently. So they may not have regular routine access to shelter or food or clothing. We know that they may be coming from unsafe situations, or they may come from a background where they're fearful of individuals either in their family or in their neighborhood. They may come from areas where financial security is a concern, or they may have a concern where their health or the health of their family members is not good. And so many of these youth do not have safety within their home community or within their own home. Additionally, love and belongingness. The need to be loved and to love is part of the human experience. The need to have a healthy and secure attachment, to be able to form friendships, to have a healthy attachment to family, is not just something that teenagers need. It's something that every human being needs. And one of the things that we find is that when you talk to youth that have experienced exploitation, many of them, when you ask them, who is somebody you can trust or who is somebody you can go to, many of these youth report that they don't have anyone and that they cannot trust anyone. And so it's these 3 layers that when they're not met consistently, or when they are being met, but there are strings attached, that can place youth at significant risk for exploitation. And this next slide is a quote by a convicted trafficker who said that my job is to make sure she has what she needs. Personal hygiene, get her nails done, take her to buy an outfit, take her out to eat, make her feel wanted, but I keep the money. And so you can see that traffickers understand that many of the youth that they are targeting don't have their basic needs or their primary needs being met on an individual basis. So they will create the lure or the perception that they will meet these needs for them, but at a cost. And so all of these things are getting done. However, there are significant strings attached. They are being commercially sexually exploited in order to get these things met. There was also a quote by an individual that had testified to Congress about 12 years ago. And one of the things that she pointed out is that whenever she interacted with the system, and when I say the system, I'm not just referring to the child welfare system, I'm referring to community systems. I'm referring to all multidisciplinary team partners that may have interactions with a youth, that when she was in foster care, when she was having interactions with law enforcement or medical staff or other individuals, that they too made it feel like, you know, you can only go to this placement if you do X, Y, and Z, or while here, I care about you as so long as I'm getting my paycheck, or I will answer your phone calls as long as it's during my business hours. And so she said that oftentimes she was made to feel, even when she was part of the system where there's a lot of community members involved in trying to help meet her needs, that everything also came at a cost. And so for her, coming from a background of significant trauma, it felt the same. And so I always say that to highlight that whenever we're working with youth that have been commercially sexually exploited, one of the key things that is incumbent upon us to do after their recovery is to make sure that we're putting youth in environments where moving forward, they're able to get their physiological needs met. They're able to get their safety and belonging needs met, their attachment needs met without strings attached. That they're able to get those needs met consistently, because we know that in the background, the trafficker has been telling them that they can't trust anyone, that they can't trust the system, and that if they go into the system, they'll get put in juvenile detention facilities, or that they won't be able to have access to their phone or to talk to anyone, or that they will get put in jail for crimes they committed as part of their exploitation. Next, I want to show a short video that highlights not only some of these vulnerabilities that we talked about, but it also really touches on what we just talked about with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so this is a short 2-minute video, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can share this video.
I'm trying to tell you what I see in myself when I look in the mirror, but all I see is a silhouette because the figure not clear. But I'm confused. I don't know what to say. I don't know who to be. I don't know what to do. All I know is what it feels like to be half dead and abused. If you don't love nobody, then nobody could hurt you. That's why I'm always stuck in places like this, where they always gotta search you. But I wanna love somebody. I want a mama that'll say this is your curfew, and a daddy that's protective enough not to let anybody hurt you. To me, it's a fantasy, but you say I'll meet the perfect family one day. I say okay to make it seem like your words are forever in my head, but it's not. To me, those words are dead and hot. Need some water to cool this fire in my chest. So many times, suicide almost became the answer, but instead, my daddy was put to rest. They say it's not my fault, but to this day, I still think it is. He'll be here in my arms and I'll be in his. No tears, no harm, and I'll still be a kid. Mama walked out on me when I was 2 because drugs was her new daughter. Something deep inside told me she fought, and there was no way she could have fought harder. I heard stories about me crawling to mama's ID, finding white powder, stumbling to the table, drinking Budweiser, and playing with that green leaf I thought was a flower. 13 or 14 years later, I'm locked up, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. I might have been through the struggle, but I'm a survivor as well. So when you ask me who I see in the mirror looking back at me, I'm gonna say a girl who survived hell.
So that video is a video that was created by a youth that has lived experience with commercial sexual exploitation. And you notice that in the video, she frequently went back and referenced many of the things that fit into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. She referenced some possible neglect with mom and substance use, and then talking about safety, not feeling safe, talking about some family dynamics with her father not being around, saying that she just wanted to be a kid, that she wanted to have attachment, that she wanted a father who would protect her. And so you can see that many youth that come from backgrounds where their basic needs are not being met, or they don't have secure attachments, or they have a history of trauma, especially relating to family, that can absolutely be a significant risk factor. This next slide also helps explain why, when working with youth that have experienced commercial sexual exploitation, why at times, even after a youth may be recovered from the situation, or when it's been identified that the youth has experienced commercial sexual exploitation, why they may still continue to return to situations or return to individuals that are trafficking them. If any of you have worked with survivors of domestic violence, you may know that there is a similar power and control wheel when we are discussing domestic violence. As a matter of fact, we know that there's a lot of literature out there that shows that even for individuals that have experienced domestic violence, that often it takes 7 times for an individual to leave that abusive situation before they're able to leave permanently. We also know that the process of leaving is one of the most dangerous situations for individuals that have experienced domestic violence. And those things still ring true for youth that have experienced commercial sexual exploitation. And the reason why so many parallels can be drawn is because some of the same tactics that are used by individuals that are domestically violent are some of the same tactics that are used by traffickers or recruiters in order to maintain control over their victims. And so they will use physical abuse, they'll use emotional abuse and intimidation. They'll use privilege, sometimes tying things like, I'll let you sleep on a bed tonight, but you have to make me X amount of money, using coercion or threats, denying or blaming or minimizing, telling the youth that they're the reason that they're in this situation, or if she just made more money, that this problem would be solved. And so whenever you think about situations and ask yourself why youth may not be willing to come forward or may not be willing to disclose exploitation, or additionally, why a youth may be returning to a dangerous situation, it's often because there's a significant amount of trauma bonding and there's a significant amount of coercion and intimidation that's used in order to try to maintain control over youth. So far, we've talked a lot about commercial sexual exploitation, and we've talked a lot about specific youth vulnerabilities that place youth at risk. We've also touched on some of the interpersonal reasons, such as peer recruitment, trauma bonding, or dysfunctional family dynamics. But we would be incorrect in assuming that the only vulnerabilities that create spaces where commercial sexual exploitation can go on is only on the youth and family level. There's also situations on the community and societal level as well that continue to reinforce and create environments where commercial sexual exploitation becomes a concern and creates environments where people feel motivated to commercially sexually exploit others. So youth that grow up in areas where poverty is a concern, or in areas where there's a lot of community violence or gang presence, or areas where youth experience a lot of discrimination and inequality, absolutely places youth at higher risk. And we see that with the information we provided a few slides ago, showing that members of marginalized communities are overrepresented in our data. And so we know that there's still a lot of staggering and concerning statistics surrounding youth of color and their exposure to violence and their exposure to discrimination and inequality. And so some of these same concerns in the community level explain some of the demographic concerns we have in asking ourselves, why do these concerning trends, why are they present? But this also gives us the answers on what we can do moving forward to try to help change this narrative and to help reduce this trend. We know that focusing on the community, making community safer, investing in, areas where there is a lot of violence or poverty, and being able to provide more resources to those areas can absolutely help reduce the amount of CSEC victimization that may be occurring in those areas. And then on the societal level, when you have things like gender biases or discrimination, there is a common misconception that only girls can be commercially sexually exploited, but we know that's not true. And we know that boys can as well. And so a lot of research shows that we continue to under-identify boys as as CSEC victims, and that there's a lot more male CSEC victims out there that are not being identified. We know that limited resources not only prevent us from being able to effectively serve youth that have experienced commercial sexual exploitation, but we know that it can also inhibit our ability to put prevention services in place to hopefully prevent CSEC victimization as well. And then, throughout the state and throughout the country, just continuing to raise awareness about this issue and helping to advocate for more federal and state laws that increase the punishments for traffickers and buyers, and also on the flip side are not punishing or arresting youth for prostitution-related charges or charges that they may incur as part of their victimization. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about our response. So the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia, one of the core components of our CSEC response team is taking a multidisciplinary team approach when responding to every concern, every CSEC concern that we receive. One of the things that we know is that if we are working with a youth and there are CSEC concerns that are present, there's often multiple different partners and agencies that are involved with that youth. We also know that a lot of times each partner may have a different piece of the puzzle, may have a different piece of information and background on that child. And that when we bring everyone together, being able to get all of that background and to put all the pieces together can not only help us in ensuring that we're making an accurate assessment, it can also ensure that we're not duplicating services and that youth are not falling through the cracks. And so this picture represents where our primary goal is almost to serve as the centerpiece of a wheel, where when we get a concern that a youth has been exploited, making sure that we're bringing all the partners that are commonly involved in these cases to the table, making sure we're bringing DFACS, Department of Juvenile Justice, the schools if possible, law enforcement, the district attorney's office, medical professionals together to make sure that we're coming up with a coordinated plan to make sure that child's getting what they need. One of the other things as part of our response that we prioritize is whenever possible, trying to get youth connected with a forensic interview. We know that when youth are asked multiple different times by multiple different people about the abuse that they experience, that it can re-traumatize the child, and it can also cause the children to shut down. And so by connecting them with a forensic interview, we're not only limiting the amount of times that we're asking youth to tell their story, we're giving them a space where they're being interviewed by somebody who's trained in talking with children in a non-leading and non-judgmental fashion. And we're also providing the space where the information that is being provided in that forensic interview could then be used to either limit or prevent a youth from having to testify in court should charges be pursued against their traffickers. Another component that we often assist in coordinating for youth where there are CSEC concerns is medical services. We know that youth that have been commercially sexually exploited are much more likely to have a history of STIs and unwanted pregnancy. We also know that they're more likely to have been forced or coerced into using drugs. And so it's important that when youth are recovered, that we're getting them connected with timely medical services so that we can screen to hopefully treat any possible STIs, to screen to see whether or not that youth is pregnant so that we can then begin connecting that youth with resources. And also screening to see if that youth has a history of substance abuse or substance use so that we can then help get that youth connected with those needed services to address those concerns. This is a quick note on mandated reporting. If you are a mandated reporter, CSEC is a form of child abuse. And so anytime those concerns come up, you always want to make a referral to the Division of Family and Children Services, and their hotline is listed here. The contact number to our hotline is also listed, 866-END-HTGA. We are option 2. We have a 24/7 hotline, and we stand ready to be able to jump in and assist no matter what time of day or night when there is a concern that a youth has been commercially sexually exploited. And then additionally, if a youth has been exploited, we always want to make a referral to law enforcement so that that case can be investigated and that the individuals that either engaged in buying that youth or exploiting that youth are being held accountable for that. This is some data from 2022. So last year we received 213 hotline calls. We received 574 web referrals, and we served over 800 youth during the year 2022. So wrapping up, we're going to talk about prevention. So we're going to talk about some red flags, some ways that you can help identify CSEC early on and what we can do to prevent it in the future. So this slide lists some of the red flags that you may commonly see with youth that have been commercially sexually exploited. I do want to highlight that this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the most common red flags. And I also, when you think about red flags and the vulnerabilities that we talked about earlier, I want you to think about red flags and vulnerabilities on a continuum. And what I mean by that is that if a child has, one or two vulnerabilities and they're exhibiting one red flag, that doesn't always necessarily mean that they are engaged in CSEC. It could, but the presence of more vulnerabilities and red flags that you see, the higher likelihood and the more concern that there is that this youth could be possibly being commercially sexually exploited. And so we talked about youth leaving home or chronic runaway, youth that go missing from care, or going absent without permission absolutely places youth at risk. And we know that oftentimes when youth run away, there isn't a solid plan in place. There is not an individual there that can consistently meet their needs. And so that automatically creates a need where the youth has to be able to meet their own needs. And that then creates that scenario where they could be approached by adults that creates that unequal power dynamic. Having distinctive tattoos or youth having tattoos that we know that the parent did not consent to or that they're not willing to explain is absolutely a concern. Times gangs and traffickers will use tattoos or branding as a means to try to show possession or control over a youth. And so anytime a youth has unexplained tattoos, that absolutely is a concern. Youth that are in the commercial sex industry often experience a significant amount of physical abuse as well as sexual abuse. And that physical abuse can not only come at the hands of their trafficker, but it can come at the hands of buyers as well. So if you have a youth that's presenting with a lot of signs of physical abuse, that is absolutely something to look out for. And then youth that are talking about informal job agreements or are discussing debt to an employer or recruiter are absolutely red flags. There shouldn't be a situation in which a youth has debt to an employer or recruiter, or if a youth is talking vaguely about job agreements they have but are not providing a lot of details, both of those can be significant red flags for CSEC. And then risky sexual behavior can be a tricky one. We always say, as part of the CSEC response team, our job is not necessarily to regulate youth sexual behavior. However, if a youth is reporting that they're engaging in sexual acts with a lot of individuals, or especially a lot of adults, that certainly is a concern and can place them at higher risk for CSEC victimization. Youth that have sudden new goods or services absolutely can be an indicator. So if a youth is getting unexplained cell phones, which is a common thing that we see, maybe they're coming back with their hair or nails done, or they're coming back with different items of value. Something else that we've seen a lot is Cash App or Venmo cards. But anytime a youth has sudden new goods or services or access to money that cannot be explained, that certainly would be a red flag. And then finally, isolation from peers or activity, or a sudden change in who the youth is associating with, especially if that is accompanied by some of these other risk factors, that absolutely can be a concern, as well as sudden changes in behavior. We talked before that behaviors are best thought of as a response to an unmet need and unaddressed trauma. And so when you have a youth that is maybe starting to display a lot of behaviors that are not typical for the youth or marks a drastic change from the way the youth previously presented, that can also be a concern as well. Here are some additional red flags with technology. I mentioned earlier that worldwide, technology is the #1 facilitator of trafficking. And so if you're working with youth and they're starting to display some of these signs, it's certainly an indicator that we may need to ask more questions or possibly make a referral in order to assess what may be going on. So if a youth is taking private phone calls or hiding the screen when you come into the room, becoming increasingly sensitive, being vague about who they're talking to, or not talking openly about what they're doing while online. And if they're increasing the amount of time they're spending online, all of those can be concerns that the youth may be either interacting with individuals that are attempting to exploit them, or they may be in an unsafe situation. A brief plug that I want to also provide here is that with technology, we've also seen a significant rise in sextortion cases. And sextortion is a situation in which a youth is being asked to provide explicit images or photos, and then that individual is then turning around and requesting money or other items of value from that youth, or is continuing to request more and more videos and photos and using threats and coercion if they do not comply. There has been a significant concern, and while not every sextortion case is a CSEC case, we know that it has profound impacts, negative impacts on youth mental health, and it is something that we are seeing a rise in. And so some of these red flags that you see here may also be a sign of sextortion, but could also be a sign of CSEC or the presence of some CSEC risk factors. So safety planning. It's important that when we're talking with youth that we make them aware that, you know, there are people that don't always have their best intentions, and helping talk to them about if situations arise, what would they do? And so this gives just some practical examples that if you are working with a youth that is experiencing commercial sexual exploitation, or a youth where you're concerned that they could, you know, they have some risk factors that place them at risk. It gives you some just practical examples of things that you can talk to youth about so that they understand that they have a safe person to go to should somebody be reaching out to them, attempting to coerce or force them to do things that they do not want to do. So prevention and action. So here are some ways that you can get involved and help stop sexual exploitation here in Georgia. So I appreciate each of you participating in this training today because hopefully you learned something and you gain more knowledge and feel more empowered about hopefully serving and getting a youth connected that may have experienced sexual abuse or exploitation, connected them with the services they need. But also talking to a youth is also important, as I talked about on the last slide, making sure that youth understand body safety, that they understand healthy versus unhealthy relationships and consent, and that they understand online safety and they know who those trusted adults are, as well as their own vulnerabilities so that they understand, you know, if there are vulnerabilities present, ways that other individuals may take advantage of that. Other ways that you can get involved is taking action by sharing this with others or sharing this with your local school district, encouraging them to implement a human trafficking prevention curriculum in their school, or having their staff trained in recognizing the signs of commercial sexual exploitation. The schools, I believe, are a critical partner in helping us in this fight because for most of the year, children spend most of their time within the school system. And so many times the schools are well equipped to be able to not only recognize the warning signs, but also can assist in intervention efforts as well. And so with that, that concludes our presentation, and my contact information is listed here on the slide. So should you have any additional questions or if you have any requests for additional trainings, we are more than happy to come out and talk to your team about commercial sexual exploitation and partner with you. So with that, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.